The golden gates of Windsor Castle had not seen her silhouette in 730 days. Behind those ancient stone walls, servants whispered in corridors where her laughter once echoed. The French delegation had arrived with their finest diplomats, expecting a routine state banquet with familiar faces. What they didn't expect was the woman who would walk through those doors that evening, transformed by 2 years of absence, carrying secrets that would reshape the very foundations of royal protocol. Catherine's heels clicked against marble floors that remembered her last tearful departure. Tonight, she wasn't just returning to a castle, she was returning to reclaim a life that the world thought they knew, but had never truly understood. The banquet would begin in 3 hours, and with it, the most extraordinary royal comeback in modern history would unfold before the eyes of an unsuspecting world. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle's courtyard as Catherine stepped out of the black Range Rover. Her absence had lasted exactly 2 years, 3 months, and 12 days, though she had stopped counting after the first year. The driver, Thomas, had been her personal chauffeur for nearly a decade, and she could see the mixture of relief and curiosity in his weathered face as he opened her door. "Welcome home, Your Royal Highness," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken questions that had circulated through the castle staff during her prolonged absence. Catherine smiled, the first genuine smile she had managed in months. Home. The word felt foreign yet familiar, like returning to a childhood bedroom after years away at university. The castle walls rose before her, unchanged and eternal, yet she knew that everything within them would be different now. She was different now. The media had speculated endlessly about her whereabouts during those 2 years. Some tabloids claimed she had entered a private rehabilitation facility in Switzerland. Others suggested she had retreated to a monastery in Scotland, seeking spiritual guidance after what they delicately termed her personal struggles. The truth, as it often was with royal matters, was far more complex and infinitely more human than any headline could capture. Catherine had spent those 2 years in a small cottage in the Cotswolds, a property that officially belonged to a distant cousin but had become her sanctuary. There, away from the suffocating protocols and endless scrutiny, she had rediscovered who she was beneath the titles and expectations. She had learned to paint watercolors, tended a small garden with her own hands, and most importantly had undergone extensive therapy to address the anxiety and depression that had nearly consumed her during her last months at court. The irony was not lost on her that she had needed to leave the palace to learn how to be royal. The woman who stepped out of that Range Rover was fundamentally the same Catherine who had departed in tears and desperation, yet she carried herself with a confidence that seemed to radiate from within, rather than being carefully constructed for public consumption. As she walked through the familiar corridors, staff members stopped their tasks to offer respectful nods and subdued greetings. She noticed how their eyes lingered on her face, searching for signs of the fragility that had marked her final public appearances before her departure. What they found instead was a serenity that seemed almost luminous, as if her time away had polished away the rough edges of royal duty and revealed something more authentic underneath. Margaret, her longtime lady-in-waiting, approached with characteristic discretion. The older woman had served 3 generations of royals and had seen enough palace dramas to fill several novels, yet even she seemed moved by Catherine's transformation. The French delegation arrived this morning, Margaret informed her as they walked toward Catherine's private apartments. President Rousseau and his wife are staying in the Blue Room, and the foreign minister has been asking specifically about tonight's seating arrangements. Catherine nodded, already feeling the familiar weight of diplomatic protocol settling around her shoulders like an old coat. Yet this time the weight felt manageable rather than crushing. During her absence, she had worked extensively with Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a therapist who specialized in treating high-profile individuals struggling with the pressures of public life. Those sessions had taught Catherine to view royal duties not as burdens to be endured, but as opportunities to serve others while maintaining her own emotional equilibrium. Her apartments had been maintained exactly as she had left them, down to the half-finished novel on her bedside table and the wilted flowers in the crystal vase by the window. Someone, probably Margaret, had ensured that fresh linens graced the bed and new flowers brightened the space, but the personal touches remained undisturbed, as if the room had been holding its breath waiting for her return. Catherine moved through the space slowly, reacquainting herself with belongings that felt like artifacts from a previous life. The formal gowns hanging in her wardrobe seemed almost costume-like now, after 2 years of simple country dresses and comfortable sweaters. Yet as she ran her fingers along the silk and velvet, she felt a renewed appreciation for the ceremony and tradition they represented. The afternoon brought a steady stream of briefings from palace staff, updating her on protocols that had evolved during her absence and familiarizing her with the key figures in the French delegation. Catherine listened intently, but with a new quality of attention that surprised even herself. Previously, such meetings had felt like attempts to fill her head with information that felt disconnected from any meaningful purpose. Now she found herself genuinely interested in the diplomatic nuances and cultural considerations that would make the evening successful. The French state banquet was particularly significant because it represented the first major diplomatic event since the recent trade agreements between the two nations. President Rousseau was known for his appreciation of protocol and ceremony, and his wife Marie-Claire was a former ambassador who understood the subtle language of royal hospitality. Catherine's presence would send a clear message about the importance Britain placed on the relationship.
As the afternoon wore on, Catherine began the elaborate process of preparing for the evening.
The ritual of transformation from private individual to public figure had once felt like putting on armor that was several sizes too small. Now, as her hairdresser worked to create an elegant updo and her makeup artist applied subtle enhancements to her natural features, Catherine felt more like an actress preparing for a role she finally understood how to play. The gown chosen for the evening was a masterpiece of understated elegance. Deep blue silk that complemented her eyes, with delicate beading that caught the light without overwhelming her figure. The palace jewelers had selected a diamond and sapphire necklace that had belonged to Queen Mary, a piece that carried both historical significance and stunning beauty. As Catherine fastened the earrings that completed the set, she caught her own eyes in the mirror and saw something there that had been missing for years: genuine enthusiasm for the role she was about to play. The transformation was not merely external. During her time away, Catherine had worked extensively on what her therapist called authentic presence, the ability to remain genuinely herself while fulfilling public duties. This meant acknowledging her natural introversion while developing strategies to engage meaningfully with others, and learning to set internal boundaries that protected her emotional well-being without compromising her effectiveness as a royal. Margaret returned as Catherine was putting the finishing touches on her appearance, carrying a folder containing the final details for the evening. The guest list included not only the French delegation but also key British political figures, cultural leaders, and representatives from various charitable organizations. Catherine would be expected to engage meaningfully with each group, remembering personal details and making connections that could benefit both diplomatic relations and her charitable causes.
Your Royal Highness, Margaret said carefully, there's something you should know about tonight.
The press attention has been. There are more photographers and reporters here than we've seen for any event in the past 2 years. Catherine nodded, having anticipated this reality. Her return was news, and the media would be watching every gesture and expression for signs of how her absence had affected her. The old Catherine would have found this prospect paralyzing. The woman she had become during her time away understood that media attention was simply another aspect of royal life to be managed with grace and authenticity. "I'm ready for them," she said, and was surprised to realize that she genuinely meant it. The anxiety that had once accompanied public appearances had been replaced by something she could only describe as purposeful calm. She had spent 2 years learning who she was when no one was watching. Now she was eager to bring that authentic self to her public role. As the time for the banquet approached, Catherine took a few moments alone in her sitting room. Through the tall windows she could see the final preparations being completed in the courtyard below. Cars were arriving with early guests, and the castle was beginning to glow with the warm light that made it look like something from a fairy tale. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, the breakdown that had forced her to leave, the long months of healing and self-discovery, and the gradual rebuilding of her confidence and sense of purpose. The woman who had fled this castle in despair had been replaced by someone who understood that vulnerability and strength were not opposites but rather complementary aspects of a fully realized human being. The phone on her desk rang softly, and Margaret's voice came through the speaker. "Your Royal Highness, it's time." Catherine stood, smoothing her gown one final time and checking her reflection. The woman looking back at her was poised, elegant and unmistakably ready for whatever the evening might bring. She had learned during her absence that true royal bearing came not from perfect composure, but from the courage to be genuinely present in whatever situation arose. As she walked toward the door that would lead her back into public life, Catherine felt a profound sense of gratitude for the time she had been given to heal, for the people who had supported her journey, and for the opportunity to return to her role with a deeper understanding of both its challenges and its rewards. The corridor outside her apartments was lined with staff members who had served her for years. Their faces reflected a mixture of professional respect and personal affection that reminded Catherine why this place, despite all its complexities, truly was home. She had left as someone trying desperately to meet others' expectations. She was returning as someone finally comfortable with her own. The grand staircase of Windsor Castle had witnessed countless royal entrances throughout its centuries of existence. But the hush that fell over the assembled guests as Catherine appeared at the top of the stairs was unlike anything the ancient walls had absorbed before. The blue silk of her gown seemed to flow like water as she descended, her hand resting lightly on the polished banister, her posture conveying a confidence that was both regal and surprisingly natural. President Rousseau, standing at the bottom of the stairs with his delegation, had been briefed extensively about Catherine's return, but nothing had prepared him for the transformation that was immediately apparent. The fragile, overwhelmed woman who had made headlines with her sudden departure had been replaced by someone who seemed to embody the very essence of gracious authority. His wife, Marie-Claire, whispered something in rapid French that roughly translated to magnificent recovery. The receiving line formed naturally as Catherine reached the bottom of the stairs. Protocol dictated that she greet the French president first, but as she extended her hand, she surprised everyone by addressing him in flawless French, asking about his flight and expressing genuine pleasure at finally meeting him in person. The president, who had expected the formal English pleasantries typical of such occasions, found himself drawn into an unexpectedly warm conversation about French architecture, a subject Catherine had apparently studied extensively during her absence. What observers in the room immediately noticed was the quality of Catherine's attention, rather than the glazed smile and automatic responses that had characterized many of her final public appearances before her departure. She seemed genuinely present with each person she encountered. When she spoke with the French ambassador about his recent work on cultural exchange programs, she referenced specific details that demonstrated not just briefing preparation but genuine engagement with the subject matter. The palace staff, scattered throughout the room in their various capacities, exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Thomas, the chauffeur who had driven her that morning, stood near the entrance and found himself blinking back unexpected tears. Margaret, positioned discreetly near the dining room entrance, allowed herself a small smile as she watched Catherine navigate conversations that would have once left her visibly drained. The transformation was not lost on the media representatives, who had been granted access to photograph the receiving portion of the evening. Royal photographers who had covered Catherine's previous appearances found themselves adjusting their expectations about the shots they might capture. Instead of the carefully composed but somewhat stiff poses they had grown accustomed to, Catherine moved with a fluid grace that made every angle seem natural and every expression authentic. James Morrison, a veteran royal correspondent for The Times, whispered to his colleague that he was witnessing what might be the most remarkable royal comeback in modern history. The woman who had once seemed crushed by the weight of her public role now appeared to wear it as naturally as she wore her grandmother's jewelry. As the receiving line progressed, Catherine encountered Lady Pemberton, an elderly woman who had been a friend of the royal family for decades. Lady Pemberton had been among the few people granted permission to visit Catherine during her retreat, and their reunion was marked by a warmth that had nothing to do with protocol. The older woman's eyes sparkled with unshed tears as Catherine leaned in to kiss her cheek, whispering something that made Lady Pemberton laugh despite her emotional state. The transition to the state dining room was choreographed with the precision that centuries of royal tradition demanded, but Catherine's movement through it felt effortless rather than mechanical. She had spent countless hours during her absence working with movement specialists and voice coaches, not to change who she was, but to help her express her authentic self more effectively within the constraints of royal protocol. The state dining room had been transformed for the evening into something approaching theatrical magnificence. The long mahogany table gleamed under crystal chandeliers, set with china that had served monarchs for over 2 centuries. Massive floral arrangements of white roses and blue delphiniums created elegant focal points throughout the room, while candles and silver candelabras cast a warm glow that softened the formal grandeur of the space. Catherine's seat was positioned to allow her optimal interaction with both President Rousseau and his wife, as well as key members of both delegations. As guests found their places, she took a moment to survey the room, feeling a profound sense of appreciation for the tradition and ceremony that surrounded her. During her darkest days before her departure, this kind of formal dinner had felt like a prison sentence. Now, she saw it as an opportunity to represent her country and facilitate meaningful connections between cultures. The first course arrived with the seamless efficiency that marked Windsor's most formal occasions. Catherine found herself engaged in a fascinating conversation with Marie-Claire Rousseau about the role of women in modern diplomacy. The French First Lady, herself a former ambassador, was clearly impressed by Catherine's knowledge and insights, which drew from her extensive reading during her retreat, as well as her own experiences navigating the complexities of public life. What made the conversation particularly engaging was Catherine's newfound ability to share personal experiences without compromising her privacy or dignity. When Marie-Claire mentioned the challenges of maintaining one's identity while serving in a highly visible public role, Catherine responded with thoughtful observations about finding balance between service and self-care, speaking from hard-won personal experience without revealing details that would have been inappropriate for the setting. President Rousseau, meanwhile, found himself drawn into discussions about environmental conservation, a subject that Catherine had become genuinely passionate about during her time in the countryside. Her observations about sustainable farming practices and renewable energy initiatives demonstrated knowledge that went far beyond briefing papers, reflecting genuine engagement with issues that would shape the future relationship between their countries.
The dinner conversation flowed naturally between English and French, with Catherine moving effortlessly between languages in a way that made everyone feel included and respected.
Her French had always been competent, but during her absence, she had worked extensively with tutors to achieve a level of fluency that allowed for nuanced discussion of complex topics.
The effort was paying dividends as she engaged in sophisticated conversations about everything from literature to international trade policy. Midway through the main course, a moment occurred that would later be described by observers as defining the entire evening. A young member of the French cultural delegation, clearly nervous about the formal setting, accidentally knocked over his water glass. The crystal shattered against his plate with a sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet room. The old Catherine might have frozen in such a moment, unsure how to respond to a breach of protocol. The woman who had returned to Windsor Castle, however, immediately leaned toward the young man with a warm smile, speaking quietly in French to assure him that such accidents happened to everyone. She then caught the attention of a server with such discretion that the broken glass was replaced, and the conversation resumed without the incident becoming a source of ongoing embarrassment for the guest. The grace with which Catherine handled the moment was noted by everyone present, but particularly by President Rousseau, who later told his staff that he had witnessed the kind of natural diplomacy that could not be taught in any protocol class. The young cultural attaché, who had been mortified by his clumsiness, found himself able to enjoy the rest of the evening because of Catherine's thoughtful response.
As the courses progressed, Catherine found herself genuinely enjoying the intellectual stimulation of the conversations around her. The French delegation had been carefully selected to represent various aspects of their nation's culture and expertise, and Catherine discovered that her own interests in art, literature, and social issues gave her common ground with nearly everyone at the table.
The conversation with Dr. Sophie Moreau, a French expert on sustainable urban development, proved particularly engaging. Catherine's own work with housing charities before her departure, combined with observations from her rural retreat, allowed her to contribute meaningfully to discussions about creating communities that balanced modern needs with environmental responsibility. Dr. Moreau later told colleagues that she had expected polite small talk but instead experienced one of the most stimulating professional conversations of her recent visit to Britain. Throughout the dinner, palace staff continued their discreet observations of Catherine's performance. The head butler, who had served at Windsor for over 30 years, noted that the atmosphere in the room felt different from other state dinners he had overseen. There was an energy and authenticity to the conversations that suggested guests were genuinely enjoying themselves rather than simply fulfilling diplomatic obligations. The kitchen staff working under the direction of the royal chef found their efforts appreciated in unexpected ways. Catherine made a point of complimenting specific dishes, demonstrating an awareness of culinary artistry that she had developed during her time learning to cook for herself in the countryside. Her appreciation was genuine rather than perfunctory, and word of her praise filtered back to the kitchen in ways that boosted morale throughout the staff. As the dinner moved toward its conclusion, Catherine realized that she had not once felt the familiar anxiety that had marked her previous formal dinners. The strategies she had learned for managing stress and staying present were working, but more importantly, she was discovering that she genuinely enjoyed using her platform to facilitate meaningful connections between people from different cultures and backgrounds. The final course was served as conversations continued to flow naturally around the table. Catherine found herself thinking about how different this experience was from her expectations earlier that morning. She had prepared for the evening as a test of her readiness to resume public duties, but it had become something much more valuable. A confirmation that her time away had not only healed her emotional wounds, but had actually enhanced her ability to serve effectively in her royal role. As coffee was served and the formal portion of the dinner began to wind down, Catherine caught Margaret's eye across the room. Her lady-in-waiting's expression conveyed both pride and relief, emotions that Catherine suspected were shared by many of the staff who had worried about her during her absence and had worked so hard to support her return. The evening was far from over. There would be reception time, informal conversations, and the complex choreography of farewells, but Catherine already knew that her return to public life was not just successful, it was transformational. She had not simply resumed her duties, she had redefined what it meant for her to serve in her role, bringing to it a depth and authenticity that had been missing before her departure. The transition from the formal dinner to the evening reception marked a subtle shift in the atmosphere at Windsor Castle. The guests moved from the state dining room to the grand reception room, where the lighting was softer and the seating arrangements more conducive to intimate conversations.
Catherine walked among her guests with a confidence that seemed to grow with each interaction, as if her successful navigation of the dinner had reminded her not just of her capabilities, but of her genuine enjoyment of connecting with interesting people from different walks of life. President Rousseau approached her as she paused near one of the room's magnificent windows, which framed a view of the castle gardens bathed in moonlight.
His expression was one of genuine admiration as he spoke, in lightly accented English, about the evening's success. "Your Royal Highness," he said, "I must confess that I expected tonight to be pleasant but routine.
Instead, I find myself genuinely inspired by the conversations we've shared. Your insights about the challenges facing our younger generations have given me much to consider for our domestic policies." Catherine smiled, touched by his sincerity. During their dinner conversation, she had drawn from her work with youth charities before her departure, as well as insights gained from extensive reading about social issues during her retreat.
What had surprised her was how naturally these experiences had translated into meaningful diplomatic dialogue. "Your country's approach to supporting young entrepreneurs has been particularly impressive," she replied. "I've been following the success of your regional innovation centers, and I believe there might be opportunities for our nations to collaborate on similar initiatives." The president's eyebrows raised slightly in surprise. This level of specific knowledge went far beyond what diplomatic protocol required, suggesting genuine engagement with issues that could strengthen the relationship between their countries. As their conversation continued, other guests naturally gravitated toward them, creating an impromptu discussion group that included the British Foreign Secretary and several members of both delegations. What struck observers was how Catherine facilitated these conversations without dominating them. During her time away, she had worked extensively on communication skills, learning to ask questions that drew out others' expertise while contributing her own insights when they added value to the discussion. The result was a natural flow of ideas that felt more like a university seminar than a formal diplomatic reception. Marie-Claire Rousseau, who had been observing from across the room, joined the group and immediately complimented Catherine on her approach to the evening. "You have created something quite special here," she said in French, then switched to English so others could understand. "Often these occasions can feel quite formal, even stiff. Tonight feels alive with real connection." Catherine's response revealed something of the philosophy she had developed during her absence. "I've learned that authenticity doesn't diminish ceremony," she said thoughtfully. "Rather, it can enhance it. When we bring our genuine selves to formal occasions, we honor both the tradition and the people we're meant to serve." This comment sparked a broader conversation about the evolution of diplomatic protocol in modern times, with various guests sharing experiences from their own careers. Catherine found herself contributing stories from her charitable work, her observations from rural life, and even lessons learned from her therapeutic journey, though always in ways that maintained appropriate boundaries while adding depth to the discussion. As the evening progressed, Catherine moved through different conversation groups, each time bringing a quality of attention that made participants feel heard and valued. With the cultural attachés, she discussed the upcoming exhibition of French Impressionist paintings at the National Gallery, demonstrating knowledge that reflected her own artistic pursuits during her retreat. With the trade representatives, she explored ways that cultural exchange programs could support economic partnerships. The media representatives, who had been observing throughout the evening, found themselves witnessing something unprecedented. Royal events typically followed predictable patterns, with conversations that rarely moved beyond pleasant superficialities. Catherine's return event was different. Guests were genuinely engaged, conversations were substantive, and the atmosphere was both dignified and remarkably warm. James Morrison, the veteran royal correspondent, found himself revising the article he had mentally composed earlier in the evening. This was not simply a story about Catherine's successful return to public duties. It was about the emergence of a new model of royal engagement that balanced tradition with authentic human connection. The moment that would later be described as the evening's most memorable came when Dr. Sophie Moreau approached Catherine with a young French student who was part of an exchange program. The student, clearly nervous about meeting royalty, had been hesitating to join conversations throughout the evening. Catherine immediately put the young woman at ease by asking about her studies in accented but confident French. When the student mentioned her research on sustainable architecture, Catherine's eyes lit up with genuine interest. She began sharing observations from her time in the countryside about traditional building techniques that modern architects were rediscovering, then smoothly transitioned to discussing the student's innovative ideas about green building materials.
What made the interaction particularly powerful was Catherine's ability to balance her royal status with genuine human curiosity.
She asked insightful questions about the students' research while sharing her own relevant experiences, creating a conversation between equals despite their vastly different circumstances. The young woman who had arrived at the castle intimidated and tongue-tied found herself confidently explaining her theories to someone who was clearly interested in understanding her work.
The conversation attracted other guests, including several British architects and urban planners who had been invited to the reception.
What began as a simple introduction became an impromptu symposium on sustainable design, with Catherine serving as a gracious facilitator who kept the discussion accessible to all participants while encouraging deeper exploration of complex ideas. President Rousseau, watching from nearby, later told his staff that he had witnessed something remarkable: a member of the royal family using her position not just to honor guests but to create opportunities for meaningful professional and cultural exchange.
The young student, he noted, would return to France with connections and encouragement that could influence her entire career trajectory. As the formal reception began to wind down, Catherine found herself in conversation with Lady Pemberton and several other longtime family friends.
These were the people who had known her before her public struggles and had supported her during her darkest periods. Their relief and pride were palpable as they witnessed her transformation.
"My dear," Lady Pemberton said quietly, "you've found yourself, haven't you? Not the person others expected you to be, but who you actually are." Catherine's response was simple but profound. "I learned that I couldn't serve others effectively until I understood and accepted myself."
The time away wasn't an escape from duty, it was preparation for serving more authentically. This conversation was overheard by several palace staff members who had worried about Catherine during her absence.
Margaret, who had served her through some of her most difficult days, felt a profound sense of relief and pride. The woman she had watched struggle with anxiety and self-doubt had emerged as someone who seemed to embody the best qualities of royal service.
As guests began to make their farewells, the choreography of departure required Catherine's presence at the main entrance to thank each delegation member personally.
This ritual, which had once felt exhausting and performative, now provided opportunities for final moments of connection. President Rousseau's farewell was particularly warm, with genuine invitations for future collaboration and personal expressions of admiration for Catherine's approach to the evening.
Marie Claire embraced her with the natural affection of someone who had recognized a kindred spirit, promising to stay in touch about their shared interests and social causes. The young French student approached Catherine last, her earlier nervousness replaced by genuine gratitude.
In halting English, she thanked Catherine not just for the evening's hospitality, but for showing her that authority and authenticity could coexist beautifully. Catherine's response, delivered in French, was that the student had reminded her why such exchanges were so valuable. They allowed people to learn from each other across cultural boundaries.
As the final car disappeared through the castle gates, Catherine stood for a moment in the courtyard where her day had begun. The transformation from morning to night felt like more than the passage of time. It felt like the completion of a journey that had begun 2 years ago with her departure in pain and confusion.
Margaret approached with the evening's final protocol requirements: thank you messages to be sent, follow-up meetings to be scheduled, and reports to be filed about the evening's success. But she also brought something more personal: messages from staff throughout the castle expressing their joy at Catherine's return and their pride in her performance. Thomas, the chauffeur, had left a simple note saying that driving her home that morning had been one of the highlights of his career. The kitchen staff had included their appreciation for her genuine compliments about their work. Even the security team had expressed their respect for how gracefully she had handled the pressure of her first public event in 2 years. As Catherine walked back through the corridors toward her private apartments, she reflected on the evening's significance. She had not simply proven that she could resume her royal duties, she had discovered a new way of fulfilling them that honored both her personal growth and her public responsibilities. The woman who had left Windsor Castle 2 years ago had been crushed by the weight of others' expectations and her own perceived inadequacies. The woman who now climbed the stairs to her private quarters carried those responsibilities lightly, not because they mattered less, but because she had learned to serve from a place of strength rather than obligation. In her sitting room, Catherine took a few moments to process the evening before beginning her nighttime routine. The blue gown that had made her feel so confident hours earlier was carefully hung in her wardrobe, but the confidence itself remained. She had rediscovered something essential about herself: that her struggles had not disqualified her from service, but had actually prepared her to serve more effectively. The final act of her evening was to write in the journal she had kept throughout her recovery. Her entry that night was brief but profound. "I came home today. Not just to Windsor, but to myself. The person I am now is who I was always meant to be, someone who can embrace both vulnerability and strength,
someone who can serve others by being authentically herself. As she prepared for bed, Catherine knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. There would be follow-up meetings about the evening's diplomatic discussions, charitable commitments to resume, and the ongoing work of rebuilding her public profile. But for the first time in years, she looked forward to these responsibilities rather than dreading them. The castle settled into its nighttime quiet around her, but the energy of the evening seemed to linger in the ancient walls. Staff members throughout the building went to sleep knowing that something significant had shifted, not just in Catherine's personal journey, but in what it meant to serve with both dignity and authenticity in the modern world. Catherine's return to Windsor Castle had stunned everyone, but perhaps no one more than herself. She had discovered that her greatest struggles had become the foundation for her greatest strengths, and that true royal bearing came not from perfect composure, but from the courage to bring one's whole self to the service of others.